You're listening to Up An Octave, a podcast by Sonivia, the podcasting agency that believes that women and non-binary people deserve to take up space in the podcasting industry because our thoughts, voices, and stories matter. Here you'll learn how to make dope podcasts that inspire, educate, convert, and most importantly, make your voice shine. I'm your host, Rue Spence, and I'm here to take podcasting up an octave. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to Up an Octave. I am so excited for you to hear this episode because I am passing the mic to Shelby Forsythia, a grief coach, author, and podcast host who helps other people who are going through grief experiences cope with their loss and find strategies to heal. She is an absolute ray of sunshine and a delight. Her work has been featured in Huffington Post, Bustle, and the Oprah magazine. If you would like to connect with Shelby, you can find more information about her in the show notes. All right, without further ado. Hi, Shelby. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
I am so excited to talk to you today.
I am so thrilled to have you. And I just want to dive in and talk about the everythingness that you do. You are an incredible asset to so many people who are in the grief space, and you do it in such a variety of ways between your online academy, different courses that you offer, in-person and virtual events, 2 books, and 3 podcasts.
Yes, it's a lot.
So first off, I want to talk about why podcasting is so significant to you within the grief space.
Yeah, I first started listening to podcasts really heavily in college, and it was a really griefy time in my life. I affectionately refer to my time in college as the 4 years of hell, not because of anything that happened in school, but because both of my parents were either sick or dying. And my dad ended up surviving, and my mother sadly did not, and she died my senior year in college right during winter break. So I had to do my last semester of school without her. And then, of course, as it is, graduation day was on Mother's Day weekend, and that was just absolute hell for me. And I was listening to podcasts more of like a fun variety and advice variety. I wasn't really listening to anything to cope with grief, but after my mom died, I was wondering, I was like, is there anything in the world of podcasting that speaks to grief? And it turns out there was. And granted, in 2013, the space was not nearly as big as it is now. I literally just got off a recording of another podcast that's about death and dying that I had never heard of until like 3 weeks ago. But oh my goodness, just having somebody who's speaking to you and what's happening in your heart and your mind and your brain and your body when you're grieving, and to not have to pick up a book at a time when you can't focus, when it's really hard to put ideas together. When it's just hard to be a human, felt like such a relief at a time that ended up being really lonely and really isolating in my life.
That's incredibly powerful. And you started your first show in 2017, is that correct?
I did, and I started it because a lot of people said I should. I don't know if that's the best reason to start a podcast, but I had started, once I was able to read, I was reading a lot of grief books and sharing quotes from them on my personal Facebook page, and then I had enough people feel moved by them that they were like, you should do something with this. So I created a public Facebook page and started talking about grief online. And enough people liked that they were like, you should start a podcast, especially because I have vocal training from when I was a kid of doing classical singing and musical theater, that they said, you have a voice to convey ideas and put words together in ways that I don't know that a lot of people do. And so you should start a podcast. And the first podcast I ever started was called Coming Back, Conversations on Life After Loss. And it was an interview style show. And it ran right up until the end of 2020. And I think COVID really put into me a kind of weariness that I think a lot of podcasters faced. And so it came to a loving close at the end of 2020, but all the episodes are still available online. And to this day, it is one of the highest sources of traffic to my work. People still discover me by listening to old episodes of this show that still exists on the internet.
I love that you're highlighting the evergreen nature of it, because that's something that's so easy to overlook. But I think it's really powerful to not overlook it, that, you can be dormant for years and still have it be such an impactful way for garnering attention to the work that you're doing.
Yes. Well, and I was dormant for quite a few years there in the world of podcasting. I tried to jumpstart two other shows. One was called Grief Seeds, and it was kind of like a live grief coaching experience where I'd go live on Instagram and then convert the recordings to audio. And then Grief Book Roundup was a 10-minute show where I would just recommend grief books that I loved. But shortly after I started those shows, my best friend died from COVID in 2022. And I was like, I can't keep up with either of these. And so after maybe only about 30 episodes combined, I let those shows dissolve, but people still discover me by listening to Grief Seeds and Grief Book Roundup on Libsyn and on YouTube and Apple Podcasts and all these places where I still pay $5 a month to have my old shows hosted there. And it is like the best $15 collectively I spend every single month because people still find me there. And as long as you're not talking about the news or like a TV show that has current episodes, it's a really incredible way to continue to be found online because especially with grief and mental health topics, regardless of what you're talking about, almost always people will resonate with what you're speaking to and with what they need help with, like the topic of dealing with guilt and grief, or dealing with family estrangement as a form of grief, or dealing with suicide loss or the death of a child. Like these are things that, for better or for worse, never get old and people continue to need help with. And so, yeah, it's been a really remarkable way for people to hear my voice and have that connection of human voice at a time when they're grieving, and to be found months and then years way down the road from when I created these pieces of audio.
Can we talk a little bit about making the decision to let some of your previous shows go? How did you come to that decision? And then how did you kind of neatly tuck the ends up into itself to give the freedom and the liberty to put your energy elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've never talked about that on like a public forum before. I think coming back, I did this the most gracefully, which was my first podcast. And it ran for 3 years. I started doing it episodically and then I got tired, so I switched it to seasonal. But every step of the way, I was letting my listeners know, here's my bandwidth, here's what I'm up to, here's what I'm capable of creating, and here's how things will change going forward. And so that podcast, I feel, had a much more hands-on and guided approach. And at the end of 2020, the whole podcast series culminated with an interview with one of my all-time favorite authors. And he had recently written a book that included some grief elements. And then after that episode, I did one more episode about, this is the end of coming back. I'm so glad you've been here and listening. You can continue to find me at shelbyforsythia.com. I just really put a bow on the whole thing. And I was really proud of that. I still miss that show sometimes because I still miss doing interview style formats. So I don't know if I'll ever raise it from the dead, so to speak, or not. But the other two podcasts, I really did end abruptly. Grief Seeds and Grief Book Roundup, both, because things in my life felt so intense at the time, I simply stopped producing. And some part of me, not necessarily regrets that, but some part of me wishes I'd had any sort of bandwidth at the time to write like a final episode and record a final episode without bursting into tears. But the circumstances that surrounded the end of both of those shows was so hard and so sad and so overwhelming that I was like, I can't say a proper farewell to these, not one that feels composed. And maybe that would feel appropriate for the grief space to be like, I'm saying goodbye and I'm bursting into tears on mic. But with everything else I had going on at the time, I was the emergency contact and sort of like a partial executor of everything my friend owned after she died, that I was like, if I'm not going to do this gracefully, I'm going to let this be something I don't do gracefully. And people who were following my story on social media, because I had posted that she died and I would be kind of off everything for a while. I was off email for months. I was off social media for a very long time. I assumed that they got it. And that's a unique blessing of working in the grief space, is that the people you're talking to when something awful and tragic happens in your life, they don't rush to you with this expectation of, but you promised us a new podcast episode every week. They deeply get it because they have had that experience in their own lives. Whereas, like, I think celebrities who go through major losses, or news anchors or public figures, there's this expectation that, well, you soldier on, you keep going, keep calm, carry on. Whereas as a grief practitioner, to be experiencing a very, very personal loss myself, almost everybody in my audience was like, yeah, we get it. Go take care of yourself and then come back when you're ready. Whether you come back to producing what you produced before, or if it doesn't feel aligned anymore, let it go. And then we'll wait for what's next. And so something I think that can also be built by podcasts that the podcasting world doesn't always pay a lot of lip service or attention to, is the fact that in hearing your voice and in knowing a lot more of your story, your audience can give you a lot more grace than if you're doing things like writing articles or showing up on mass video. The fact that I have been in people's ears now for almost like 4 years on and off since 2017, they know who I am and what I care about and how I'm impacted by hard things that happen to me. And so when hard things inevitably do happen, they're like, we can trust Shelby to step away and take care of herself, but then also to eventually come back. And there's a really lovely sort of one-on-one human trust that gets built when that happens too.
There is so much that I want to unpack with that. So first, something that I teach, obviously being in the professional podcasting space, best practice is something that I'm always striving for and educating on. But I do like to say, podcasting is not heart surgery. You can have your absolute worst day of podcasting and no one's going to die. And so with that, if you do just need to step away, it can just be done. And so I think it's really interesting to hear how the space that you're in informed the way that you let things go, but then also B, how you made the choices and the revelation that it is okay to just sometimes step away from things that no longer feel important, especially when you are in a time of personal distress or really needing to put focus literally anywhere else.
Yeah, I think when podcasting starts to feel like a slog or a chore, that's kind of my intuition being like, it's time to be done. When you're bored with what you've created and you aren't excited about creating anything else, not just temporarily, but kind of like for a long time. If that feeling comes up for me for more than 90 days, I'm like, now we really have to sit down and look at it. Because sometimes it's just like I'm tired by the rest of my life and I have to put a podcast out, but I'm like, oh, that goes away after 3 days. But for larger things, especially like coming back, and that was the same year that I released my second book, Your Grief, Your Way. So a pandemic had started in March. I got a book deal earlier that year in January, and my book was on the shelves by September. And I don't know how much you know about book publishing, but usually it takes 2 to 3 years from contract to shelf. And I was part of an experiment to see how fast can we reasonably put a book in the world in 9 months. It was very fast. And then the whole world was grieving, and I was facing job loss and a recurrence of some mental health issues that I had from being indoors and kind of isolated all the time. And doing an interview style show, I was like, this just no longer resonates. This feels like more than I have to give at this time in my life. And it seems like a really okay season to draw it to a close. And so that was something I was able to do after that lingering feeling of, I'm bored, I'm at the end of my rope energetically, and I feel no more creative energy kind of oriented in this direction. And then for things like Grief Book Roundup and Grief Seeds, it was one of those moments in life where grief taught me, like, here's what's important and here's what can fall by the wayside. And if you come back to get it later, great. And if you just leave it on the ground, it's also okay. People will understand and people will forgive you. And at that time, I remember I even backed out of one-on-one coaching calls with people who were deeply grieving because my friend was in the ER. And I was like, I don't know whether or not she will survive, so I need to cancel this call. And I don't know what became of those clients. It was the first time we were ever meeting with each other. And I said, I am so sorry. An unforeseen, truly unforeseen emergency has presented itself and I have to tend to it. And I wish you well. And here's some referrals to other folks who have availability today. But I am no longer one of them. And I am so sorry. And she ended up dying a week later. And it's one of those things where if somebody's going to hold a grudge against me for ending a podcast abruptly, then I'm probably not the creator for them. Because there's a humanity in letting people or granting people the grace to allow something to end. This is a much larger philosophical conversation, but I think we live in a society that's not really okay with endings. It's a very grief-averse society, but also just an ending-averse society. And so often we continue to produce things like podcasts or other creative materials long past their time. And it's also really okay to set them down, whether you say a formal goodbye to them or you simply just set it down and don't come back. And I know so many people are afraid of things like pod fade or getting burnt out by a season and not knowing when you're going to put another season out into the world. But also, too, grief and death have taught me so much that it is just so much more precious to feel alive about what you were doing and to approach your art, your work from that energy. And if it's not coming from that energy, it might be worth questioning why you're putting in so much effort to put it out in the first place.
Yes. All right. All done. Bye. You nailed it. That's everything about podcasting forever. See ya. This has been Up an Octave. Catch you later. Yeah. No, but I agree so strongly with you. And I feel like your audience can tell, we have that term jumping the shark for this very phenomenon of things that continue to exist after it's their time to, as you so eloquently say, set them down. But it's very clear to me that you love podcasting and have been bitten by the podcasting bug because in December, you started your new show.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my God. It had been bothering me for months. And by bothering me, I live in the Elizabeth Gilbert idea world where ideas are alive and they nag us until we bring them to life, or they go bite somebody else and then they bring that to life. But yeah, I have, going back to my college days, I've been obsessed with advice columns and advice podcasts since I discovered the format. But even as a kid, I would love reading like Dear Prudence and Ask Amy in the newspaper. And I was so transfixed by this idea that like somebody out there has an answer, maybe not the answer, but like somebody out there has a response to what you're going through. And that there are people out there that are asking questions, waiting for a response. And to think that, well, I've been working with grieving people for 8 years and I've been grieving for 10. And to think that I could answer questions that people might have along the way as they're grieving from this place, not of I know better, but like I'm just a couple steps ahead on the path, felt really cool to me. And to bring this sort of empathetic, validating, tell life stories, tell client stories, give examples, Dear Sugars vibe to it. I mean, it all just really came together into a marriage of this is exactly what I want to be putting out in the world right now. And I think so many people need things that are like quick, dip in and dip out, really powerful, heartfelt advice for the griefy times that we're living in.
Yes, no, absolutely. Can you tell me a little bit about, so I know, being a huge fan of that format, how has starting a show that is a solo cast, but also has contributions from other people, so it's not quite an interview, but it's also not quite by yourself truly, because you are, using other people's words and thoughts to generate your content. How has the experience of getting this show started and off the ground and gaining traction been different from the different formats of shows that you've done in the past?
Yeah, I don't know that I like it better or worse than an interview show. It's just different. I love interview shows for the spontaneity that they provide and the human connection, and you're kind of like riffing on what somebody else has already said. I'm picking up what you're putting down kind of energy. But oh my goodness, the mental tax that you pay when scheduling interview shows, when making sure you've got enough in the docket, when somebody cancels and you have an emergency, making sure their sound equipment is good, and then doing all these things in post-production to make sure that your sound is at the same level. And then what happens if Zoom cuts out and people in different time zones and countries? Oh man, like people do not give enough credit to people who do interview shows, because the logistics of having another human appear on your podcast, for as smooth as it sounds on the end, my goodness, the lead up to doing an interview show to me is exhausting. So for as much as I love doing them, I was like, that's not something I have bandwidth for right now. What can I do that still feels like it's me talking to another person, but it doesn't necessarily involve another live person who is a presence on the other side of the mic that is also on a mic of their own. And so I came up with this idea of like a Dear Sugars or advice style podcast, because I get a lot of the same questions over and over and over again from different people in different formats. And so somebody will ask a question about living with guilt after a loss in my online course, and coincidentally, I'll be covering the same topic with a one-on-one client, or I'll just have read a book about it. And all of these things kind of coming together, I'm like, so guilt and grief is a topic worth talking about. And so I had to do an entire episode on I'm feeling guilty for feeling good after my person died. Is this okay? And there will be other topics and conversations that maybe are lesser known that I love talking about, but the grief space, the network of healthcare workers and grief coaches and death doulas and spirituality guides maybe aren't having these larger conversations about elements of grief. So for example, being a queer person who's grieving and the blessings of that, but also the downfalls of that. There are things about being queer that prepare you for grieving, and there are things about being queer that make grieving even harder. And so to have an episode that's specific to that, I don't know that anybody's talking about that right now. And so to kind of generalize and specialize all on the same show is really cool. And to do it in this way that doesn't require somebody else's live in-person input, it was just this perfect combination of here's how I can cover and talk about a lot of what I want to talk about and what people are asking me without having to do the additional legwork of cooperating with another human who's live to make it happen.
And that right there is why I only do one interview show a month. Because you are just so spot on. I mean, it takes extra thought, and you do things slightly differently, and you are beholden to another person's schedule and their technology and their knowledge of how to use that technology. If you're not talking to a podcaster, especially, there are a lot of moving parts. So I absolutely think that that's valid, especially for folks who are still considering what format feels right for them. So something that people are always thinking about and inquiring, more information about from me is how do you get people to write into you, especially when you're new and you've been in this space now for 8 years, like you've mentioned, so your name carries some weight and has some traction. But for people who maybe don't have as large of a digital footprint, how do you get people to start writing in?
Yeah, and this was hard. And I laugh at myself because I look back at my early episodes of Coming Back and I thought, oh yeah, I can totally be as big as like Dan Savage in the Savage Lug Pass, where he has people call in and leave voicemails, like more than 15 people every single week. And I'm like, I can get that big really fast. And then I was very quickly humbled. And I ended up in my first episodes of Coming Back, and they're cringy to me now. But if you go back and listen to like episodes 1 through 12, there are voicemails from friends and family members. There are write-in questions from people I know personally. Because I was like, somebody please just ask me anything so I have something to answer on this show. And there was this, not a desperation, but like this need for community that I wanted, or for like a bigness that I wanted that I didn't have because I was such a baby in the grief space and the podcasting space. And even now in the grief space, there's something still so, I think, maybe intimidating or scary about telling all of your grief story, or even a part of your grief story, in a public space. So one of the way that I've structured the show, at least for the first 10, 15 episodes or so, was to use platforms like Reddit and Facebook and Instagram comments, and even notes I've taken from previous one-on-one sessions with clients over the past 8 years, in combination with things like Dear Sugar's archives and ChatGPT, to generate kind of Frankensteined permutations and combinations of questions that people might ask of somebody who's a grief coach. And in the style of Dear Sugars, I always sign off with some sort of anonymized name, like Grieving in Minneapolis, or Numb from the Nose Down, or Anxiously Avoiding My Grief, or something like that. And so people feel when they're listening, they can identify with the person who's written the letter, because there's not necessarily age or gender, unless I somehow write that in to the episode itself. And then they can just sort of take the wisdom that I offer as more broad or generalized knowledge for whatever they're going through, even if their loss isn't exactly the same, or even if their circumstances aren't exactly the same. So the first 10, 15 episodes of Dear Grief Guide were generated, whether I pulled a Reddit post from a grief support group and changed the genders and the relationships and some of the language, or tried to age up or age down the way people were talking. Yeah, again, pulling old notes from one-on-one coaching calls I've had with people in the past and changing names, genders, relationships, all that jazz. And then even sourcing questions from online coaching groups, all with this slant of it must be. I started developing my own criteria when I would generate these in ChatGPT or even write them myself. It's got to be 500 words or less, especially for reading on a podcast and sharing on social media. That's me reading a letter for about 2.5 minutes or so, and then responding to it for about 10 minutes. And also kind of what's been really funny to me, and we can have a whole separate conversation about this too if you'd like, is there are things about ChatGPT that are helpful, and then there are things that are a hindrance. So the things that are helpful about it are that it can kind of get the ball rolling in terms of a format. It can make something sound like a letter. But where it fails, and where it really gets under my skin as a grief practitioner, is that a lot of the cliches that ChatGPT uses are the same phrases over and over again. So I cannot tell you how many auto-generated letters I created that said, I'm grappling with grief, or I'm drowning in an ocean of emotion or something like that. And I was like, you chat GPT, you keep saying this phrase over and over and over again. And this is not everyone's grief experience. So using metaphors that my clients have used with me, using language that I see people using on Reddit and Facebook grief support groups, and even over Slack, where I'm a member of several grief groups myself, using other ways that people describe their grief so that there's a variety of perspectives that are included in these composite letters has really been what jump-started the show. And then, as you know recently, Rue, because you're my podcast editor, is that in the past maybe month and a half, I have started actually receiving submissions. So I always, from day one, I had a place where people could submit their questions, because when people know you can ask a question, then they get excited about submitting their own. And just in the last month and a half or so, within the first 20-ish episodes of the show, which is really remarkable to me, I've had 2 people submit questions on the actual form, the website where they can find the show. And that's the more formal way of asking a question about grief. But then I also have had people slide into my DMs on Instagram and say, I'm dealing with this. Can you make a podcast episode about it? In which case I'll ask them to share a little bit more details about their life or their circumstances or their situation, as much as they're willing to. And I say something like, I would love to anonymize this and turn it into an episode for you. Would that be okay with you? And so I get their consent to broaden and change the language and metaphor of their story a little bit, but not the core question. So I still get to answer their question while they still get to remain anonymous. And so there's a few letters that are coming up here in the next few weeks that are actual submissions from people that are grieving a loss. And I am just so humbled every single time that happens. I'm like, I'm not answering some composite letter of a question I've answered in the past or somebody's Reddit question from 4 years ago. I am answering somebody's question who wrote into me a week ago. And what an honor and a privilege that is. So it feels really cool. I'm almost crying, but it feels really cool and humbling and profound to know for certain that I didn't invent this letter, that there is another human on the other side of this that's waiting for a response back. And for as much as I don't necessarily want to admit it, it does change the tone of my response a little bit. I don't know that other people can hear it, but I can definitely feel it when I'm speaking to a response of there is another human on the other end of this that is really tuning into what I have to say.
It's funny that you bring that up. As you mentioned, I do edit for your show. I can hear it. I don't think anyone else who is not in our brains can. And maybe it's because you'll giddily start out with saying, oh, this one came from a person. But I can hear it. And I think it does. It changes the way that you hold it a little bit. And I think that that's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily matter because they're all coming from people. But I do think that as a creator, when someone hands you something very delicate, whether it's a joy or a sorrow, and says, hi, can you help me carry this? Can you carry this in public for me? It does. It changes the way that you respond to that. That, no matter where this information is coming from, because, if it is someone that, I've answered this question before for a one-on-one or something like that, that's different than someone who is in this moment saying, hi, this thing is hard right now.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There's more of a timeliness to it. And because so many things about grief, again, are timeless, but one of the coolest letters I received was from a graduate student in Europe who was getting ready to plan a celebration of life for their friend who died, and the anniversary is coming up here in May. And I was like, this is time sensitive. This I got to get a response out to this before the anniversary of their death happens. And so constructing, here are the tools and here are the wisdom and here's the how-to I can offer you, in addition to let's put this together in a timely fashion. Rue, I got to tell you, I don't know if you know this, but I have about 28 podcast ideas upcoming, not published, but upcoming, that just kind of sit in the back of my planner because I still am old school and I write things down. And it's so funny because at the beginning of the year, I operated on the assumption that no one would ever write me a letter. And so I wrote down the names of all the episodes, and I have grid on the side of has it been recorded? Has it been edited? Has it been put in Libsyn? Has it been published on the blog? Has it been put on social media? And is it uploaded to Insight Timer, which is a meditation app where you can upload podcasts and get paid for them? We can talk about that later too, if you want. But for each episode, I'm checking off each little grid box of when it gets completed. And when somebody writes me a letter, somewhere in my brain is oh, damn, now I'm off my own schedule. And I have to write in teeny little letters where this new episode is between the ones that I'd already pre-planned. And so It's hilarious because I'm like, they're screwing with my system. And I was like, no, but that's the goal. I want so many people to write in that I no longer have to come up with the ideas for this show, that every single idea is something that is on somebody's heart right now that I can answer with some sense of urgency and some sense of timeliness.
Absolutely. And I have a very similar spreadsheet. So I love that we are such kindred.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but you brought up insight. And in general, I'm curious about hearing how your podcast, how it's structured, how it's grown, how your podcasting experience has grown, because Coming Back is still a top 2% podcast. So I'm sure that there are people who are in the early stages who would be interested in hearing about how you've grown it, your grief coaching business, and the offers that you have, and then how that fits in with like Insight Timer and the other ways that you're getting support through your podcasts.
Yes, here's how much I know about my own shows is I had no idea Coming Back was a top 2% podcast.
Hey, guess what, Shelby?
I'm kind of glowing right now. I'm freaking out a little bit. I had absolutely no idea that was reality. That's fantastic. I had no idea. And I haven't produced a single episode, made any reference to it or announcement about it since it ended in December of 2020. That is how old and how in the back of my brain it lives now. And yet, I pay $5 a month to Libsyn to keep it hosted on Libsyn and all major podcast platforms. It still lives on YouTube. There's so many people I work with too. My primary demographic is generally women between the ages of 25 and 65, and a lot of people don't know how to use podcast apps. So shout out to YouTube as a publishing destination. If you're not putting your shows there, it is a missed opportunity, because so many people have found my work just from the titles of episodes, like SEO wise, of either people, authors that they love that I've interviewed and I've been found that way, or topics I cover like facing anxiety and grief, or what do you do? How does your sex life change after loss? And they have found my work that way. And it's just been a cool backdoor into getting introduced to my work. That's a tangent. But yes, in terms of marketing and monetizing, I think this is a big question from podcasts. So I tell new people, do not, unless you already have a deal with some sort of company, do not go in expecting to make money on your show. There are ways you can have your podcast be a doorway to making money, but it's not necessarily a money-making machine in and of itself. I didn't discover Insight Timer until probably about 2 years of podcasting with Coming Back, because I remember there was a 2 long weekends where I uploaded every episode I had onto there. So if your show is very specifically, this is kind of niche oriented, in the mindfulness, mental health, meditation, spirituality space, then there may be room for you on Insight Timer. If it's for something else like news of the day or true crime, not a place to upload your shows, but Insight Timer is the world's largest free meditation app, and they accept podcast submissions as a form of audio on the platform. And just like YouTube, just like Calm, just like Headspace, it's a search engine related to mindfulness. And so anybody who's searching for grief or loss or death or relationships or inspiration or life lessons or advice is a tag that I use on that app, they will find my podcast and my work. And for every listen that you get by somebody on Insight Timer, and it has millions and millions of users, you get paid like cents on the dollar. It's not a lot of money, but it's really nice. Every month or two, I get some sort of payment in my PayPal account of anywhere from $10 to $60 from people who have listened on Insight Timer. And it's because of the type of work I produce. And it's also a really cool platform to interact with people. They can leave reviews of the tracks that you submit on Insight Timer and let you know how it's helped them. And so one of my biggest, most downloaded ones on Insight Timer is about suicide loss. And so many people say this is such an under talked about topic in my circle of friends. So I'm so glad I was able to find something here. And so it lets me know what else to keep producing that really resonates with people. So it's a neat platform for getting paid a little bit for your work and then also engaging with people who are listening. And it's a pretty easy process. I don't put mid-roll ads into my podcast episodes, so it's very easy to slice off the end credits where I'm promoting myself and my work. So my podcast literally ends when I sign off with the end of a letter. And so I cut out the end music. I cut off, here's all my social media handles. I cut off my website, and that is submittable to Insight Timer because they want no ads and no promotions to outside sources. So I introduce the podcast, there's the theme music, blah, blah, blah. And then I read the letter, and then I answer the letter, and then I say goodbye, and then it ends there. In terms of other ways I've been able to monetize the podcast or make money from having a podcast, The two biggest examples I have are an older one from coming back where I was invited to guest as a presenter on something called the Bereavement Cruise. And it's literally what it sounds like. It's a cruise ship full of grieving people that goes on a traditional cruise, but then during the day there's workshops and presentations. And it's like a giant TED Talk conference, but all about grief on a cruise ship. And we just all sail away. And as a part of being a presenter on the Bereavement Cruise, there was an affiliate program where for every guest that I brought onto the cruise who used my code, Shelby Forsythia, whatever, they could get a discount for the cruise, then I would get paid a commission. And people from all over the world, from the Netherlands to Boston, Massachusetts, were listening to my podcast. And I put in an ad at the beginning and end of every episode for about 3 months leading up to the cruise that I was going on this, that if you wanted to sign up and join me and meet me in person, you could do that. And then you could get a discount. I ended up making $700. And I was like, this is wild. And I got to meet listeners of the podcast who I'd never met in person before. And the funniest one was a woman who approached me and said, I hope this isn't insulting to you. And I was like, oh God, what are you going to say next? And she goes, after my husband died, I couldn't sleep. And I found your podcast on YouTube. And I've never really listened to a single episode, but the sound of your voice and the sound of your guests talking about how okay it is to grieve, that's the only thing that's helped me sleep at night. So I'm so excited to meet you.
Wow.
And I had never met her before. And God, it's one of my favorite stories to tell ever because it was so touching that not all people listen to podcasts to learn. Sometimes they just listen to be with you. So they're not just by themselves, especially in really hard experiences. But advertising the bereavement cruises as an affiliate on my podcasts allowed me to have some income as well, which was really cool. And then as a part of it, I interviewed all my other presenters because it was an interview show. And so we were talking about the bereavement cruise and what we were going to talk about on the cruise while also having mid-roll and beginning and ending ads for the cruise. So it was very cruise heavy. But I also told my listeners that I said for the next season, I'm going to be devoting the entire thing to everybody who's coming on this boat with me. And if you want to come with us, you can get a discount. And so it was really targeted, but still orbiting around this main topic of grief. And then the last thing I'll say, and the thing I do right now, is use my show as like a top of, for the marketing heads out there, as a top of funnel awareness way for people to get in touch with me. So they hear my voice, they hear what it's like to be coached or guided by me. I often refer to what I do not as grief coaching, but grief guidance, because not everybody wants a coach, but almost everybody wants a guide. And at the end of every episode, there's an invitation to look in the show notes for a link to take a free workshop that I host called Grow Through Grief, 3 Ways to Stop Feeling Stuck and Start Moving Forward. And the lovely thing about that is I have done the work on the back end through an entirely separate course and learning process. It's taken me about 1.5 years or so to get set up because I do have a full-time job in addition to being a grief coach, but an evergreen funnel. So people can watch the workshop and then they get a series of emails over about 26 days that invite them to join my online course and community, which is where I really do what I call the hard work and the heart work of moving through grief. And I've had dozens of people join this course through the years, and so many people have told me that listening to my podcast and my work was what got them hooked on working with me. And especially because people need to hear things often 10 to 20 times to even really stick it in their minds. A weekly podcast is such a great way to talk about something that you do all the time that's always open, like an online course or a workshop or something like that. And it's been a really neat way also to give examples of things I've worked through with clients on the show. So in the middle of an episode, for instance, about I'm grieving 2 people, I don't know who to grieve first, I told a story about somebody who was in Life After Loss Academy that was also grieving 2 people and they didn't know who to grieve first. And so I was like, here's a story and I've worked through this before and here's what we did together. And you can have that same experience too. If you'd like to sign up, you can follow the link in the show notes. And so it's been a really neat way to attract people to my work in kind of a softer way. It's a little bit harder to track than something like the bereavement cruise, which is a very direct line to this is the only place I'm advertising it and you have to use the special code. So it's a little vaguer to keep tabs on who's coming to the course because of the podcast and who's just coming because they find out about it on social media or email or a friend invited them. But I do know that no matter what, it's helping people know that there is such a place for their grief to belong. And it's still open for as long as the podcast is running, the course is open, which is really lovely for grieving people. Because sometimes even if they don't need the resource right now, just knowing it continues to exist can be comforting too.
Cosign. I agree with everything that you're saying. So much of that is what I encourage from people. So it's great to hear that you are actually a testament of it working. So that's wonderful.
Yes. Well, it's really, I went to school for marketing. So I tell people that's like my greatest strength as a grief coach is I came in kind of knowing how to market myself. The trick has been to reach enough people to market to. And I think that's the perpetual challenge of any of us who are online business owners. It's like, yeah, I know what I do is good and I know how to tell people about it. But getting people to actually say yes and click the buy button or click the free consult button or whatever it may be, that's the challenge. And so really continuing to show the depth of my work and what I'm able to talk about and what I'm able to help with and the pain points and the things I'm able to solve for people or at least soften in the world of grief. And podcasting does that just so well as a medium. That's really been what has helped me connect with people who are out there who are on the fence about whether or not we should work together.
I love everything about that. That is, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Gosh, this has been just absolutely lovely. And I feel like I could keep talking podcasting with you for so long because there are things that we haven't even had a chance to get into, but I know how busy you are. And so I want to thank you so much for taking the time. Please tell people how they can connect with you, how they can engage with your show, and all of the other places that you are doing the truly incredible work that you're doing.
Yes, I always keep this part simple because I know you're listening, so you're probably also doing dishes or in the car or working out. If you're anything like me, you're doing laundry. Because I hate doing laundry, but I'm like, if I can listen to a podcast while I do it, maybe I'll like doing laundry.
Yep.
It hasn't worked yet, but I do listen to a lot of podcasts as a result. So I like to keep it really simple. Everything I do is at shelbyforsythia.com. If you want to work with me, it's there. If you want to find me on social media, it's there. If you want to listen to the podcast or buy one of my books or buy a cool grief sweatshirt, you can do all of that. All at shelbyforsythia.com.
Wonderful, Shelby. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to help me take podcasting up an octave.
I love it. And as somebody who was trained in voice and musical theater, the pun and the literal definition of up an octave was not lost on me. And I was so thrilled to even discover you in the world and just love the work you're doing. I'm so glad to have been here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh my goodness. I could seriously talk to Shelby for hours. She is just such a joy to chat with. So if you would like to listen to her podcast or even write in a letter asking for some support in your own grief experience, you can find all of those links in the show notes for this episode. But next week, I will be back to talk about going from page to podcast. So taking things from their inception to actually producing them. So you're not going to want to miss that. In the meantime, the party keeps going over on Instagram at Sonivia Studios, where you can find out all about what I've got going on and how to get in touch. Thank you so much for listening and helping me take podcasting up an octave.